Breadth of research agenda allows me to focus on a lot of different topics, which I thoroughly appreciate. And so when I had an opportunity to come and talk to the QualLab, I decided I wanted to have a conversation, since I knew it would be a smaller and more intimate group, with an idea that I'm just now starting to really dive into as a research interest. So I've been interested in this in quite some time, but I haven't really approached it from this particular lens. And so I'm excited to be able to share this with you and to be able to talk a little bit about this topic. So again, I'm Dr. Carmen McCallum. These images represent myself. You know, I am a Black woman. I identify as being a Black woman. I'm also a social worker at heart. So I have my master's in social work. And so it really has shaped my lens on everything that I do in higher education, because I just come from a different perspective of thinking about the person and the environment and being really in tune to what's happening to people with their identities, and how also resources and social capital really play a role into that. I'm also a first generation college student. So when I think about graduate education, for me, I was a first generation PhD student, first generation master's student, et cetera, et cetera. And that does have different connotations. I didn't really know what I was doing. To be honest, I didn't even know that a PhD was a research degree. I just knew I wanted to get the PhD because I wanted to move up in my position. I was an academic advisor, and I knew that I needed a PhD in order to do that. And so I went into the PhD program at the University of Michigan. And so the little eyeglass guy over here, or gal, is me as a researcher. So I am a qualitative researcher by heart. I really do dabble into mixed methods, but I am a qualitative researcher. And so even in my graduate training, when I was taking stats classes, I enjoyed them, but it was the qualitative research that really fueled my passion to understand people's stories, and then for me to be a lens through which those stories were being told. So I came upon this topic reflecting back on the research projects that I have been a part of, again, being a Black woman and focusing on issues that are around minoritized and marginalized, underrepresented populations. And so as I think back on that and I think about my graduate school experience, before I keep going, Penny, I just have one question. I know that you are recording this, and I see that the box is around you instead of me. And so I'm wondering if it's recording you and not me as I'm speaking.
Oh, I think it's around, or usually when it records, it's the PowerPoint itself and people on the side. Bakari, with the last ones that we've recorded, is that the case, or?
Yes.
I can turn, okay.
Okay, now that whatever you just did, just tuck away. Like, I think it was highlighting you for some reason.
Oh,
so whatever you just did is perfect. I just want you, I don't want you to post this and then it's not what you.
I know we want you. You know we want you. Thank you.
Yeah, so reflecting on my graduate school experiences, I realized that there were several people in my circle who were also experiencing trauma due to their research experiences. So for example, I had a colleague who was researching racial identity construction among Chinese and Filipino Americans. And I remember as she was collecting her dissertation that she literally had to stop during her data collection phase because the stories were so powerful and they were so traumatic, dealing with racism, discrimination, all of those different things. And it was making her reflect on her own journey. And so she had to take pauses in doing her data collection. Another colleague studied graduate student socialization and a reproduction of inequality, specifically during the qualifying study in that process. And that was the part of her graduate degree that she struggled with the most. And so in hearing those studies, hearing how inequalities were being reproduced in graduate education, again, she began to re-traumatize herself as she was hearing these stories over and over and over. And then myself, as a tenure track qualitative researcher, again, studying vulnerable populations, most recently in 2 studies, well, in my own dissertation, I found that I was being affected by the stories that I heard. But also I hired an undergraduate student who was a Black female to actually transcribe my interviews, and she was interested in going to graduate school. My dissertation focused on African Americans and their decision to pursue the PhD. And some of the stories that were shared, again, facing with discrimination, oppression, being told that you couldn't do it, you didn't belong here, this undergraduate student decided not to pursue a graduate degree because she herself had become traumatized. And this graduate student mental health study that I'm currently doing, one of my graduate students has decided to seek therapy based on what they're hearing from these interviews. And then a Black faculty study that I'm working with another colleague, one of her students just decided she had to again step away, that these studies became so powerful, and just hearing over and over again these traumatic experiences, and then being able to connect it to your own experiences, right? So we are particularly studying individuals who look like us and share our identities. And so a lot of the things that we hear really touch our own essence. And so because of that, we are experiencing this trauma. And so I went into the literature to kind of figure out, okay, what is going on? I've heard about secondary trauma. And so I wanted to do a little bit of investigation. And so what's happening is this vicarious trauma. And you hear a lot about this in the counseling field, but you do not hear about this in educational research, and you do not hear about this from a qualitative researcher perspective. Typically, it's for counselors or social workers who are known to hear these painful stories, but as researchers and those who are pulling people's lived experiences, we are again experiencing the same trauma when we're hearing stories and witnessing people's pain, fear, and terror for surviving whatever situation they may be involved in. And when you're researching underrepresented populations and marginalized populations, and particularly Brown and Black individuals, you can experience racialized trauma. And we know within this last year, with all of the racial uprising that we experienced and we saw, that it just became more intense. So it wasn't that the killing of Mr. Floyd exposed something to me or I think others that we didn't know existed, but it just was another moment. So one of my research participants stated in an interview on a graduate student in mental health that it was another moment, but these moments happen all the time, right? And so you can't turn on the TV, you can't turn on the news without hearing or seeing some of this. And so this really does create racialized trauma. And so as a qualitative researcher hearing these stories again, you can experience this. The nature of qualitative research lends itself to this because we are the researcher and we are the instrument in which the data comes through. And this occurs whether you are post-positivism and you're thinking, I'm going to be objective, or a social constructivist, because whether or not you fall in either one of those camps, you still are the instrument in which this research is coming through. And so you're hearing these stories over and over again, and you're experiencing it as you're diving deep into the data. We're asked to bring our full selves to these research projects. And so in order to do that, we have to come in with empathy and sympathy and understanding, and to really understand what that person's experience is if we want to tell their story correctly. And we're not only hearing these stories at the interview stage. This is a multi-stage process. So we're hearing it during the interview. If you decide to transcribe your own interview transcripts, you're hearing it then. Then when we begin to code, we're again reliving the trauma. And then as you're going back in to find things, you're reliving the trauma. So again, you are repeatedly being exposed to these stories and incidents, which is why you can experience this trauma. And so what's really interesting is that, again, there is conversation in the medical field, in the counseling fields, but there is really no conversation about this for educational researchers, and in particular qualitative researchers who experience this trauma. The only person that really found that talked about this in a significant way was Howard and Hammond. And another article talked about this, Howard and Hammond talked about that the risk for researchers is actually greater than it is for counselors, because researchers are not allowed to help. We're not allowed to engage with the person who's sharing this trauma and say, this is a resource that you can use. Go talk to this counselor, go to this office and seek help in order to help you deal with the pain that you're experiencing. And it is true that we may be able to pass them a piece of paper with a list of resources at the end, but it's not the same thing as being able to engage with them in a holistic way. There are some ways in which qualitative research talks about this. So there's conversation in the literature that talks about reactivity, but really when we're talking about this is a response of the researcher and the participant. And again, the light is being shown on the participant. So it's really trying to understand how the research affects the subject and not necessarily the researcher. So the most probably popular or well-known incident of this is kind of the Hawthorne effect. But again, we always talk about how that research study impacted the participant, not what happened to the researcher. So phenomenologists talk about self-talk. We have grounding theorists who talks about memos and ethnographers who talk about journals. But even in those moments when you're doing a self-reflection to kind of see where you're standing, you're always encouraged to do that reflection in relation to your subject, right? You're not really doing it in reflection of where you are in your own mental health. And there's no guiding agency that overlooks that either. So, we have to do a lot of work to get our studies through IRB. But again, IRB talks about vulnerable populations of the subject. There's no guidelines or warnings for researchers. So a lot of qualitative researchers are walking into these subject matters with not necessarily understanding how it may impact them. And if we don't begin to start thinking about the mental health of those who do research, if it's not addressed, people are going to experience stress, which, as part of a graduate student, you experience stress. And the culture of graduate school wants us to believe that that's normal, that you should be stressed, you should be depressed, you should experience anxiety, graduate school is hard. I always push back on that and say, why does it have to be that way? Like, just because you want to learn and you want to understand a subject matter in a deep way, why do I have to, fall asleep at my computer at 12 o'clock at night? Why does the process have to be this way, right? And so if we continue to allow people to be stressed, to be burned out, to experience compassion fatigue, right? So someone who's experienced compassion fatigue as a qualitative researcher may be walking through the steps without really feeling a connection to the subject matter because they're removing themselves from that because it's too painful. And finally, if it's not addressed, there's actual physical health consequences that can occur. So one of the studies, the Black faculty study that I was mentioning, is really looking at the connection between being a tenure track faculty member and health outcomes. And what we're finding is people are having heart attacks, they're having high blood pressure, they're going to see their therapist, all of these physical attributes because they're experiencing stress. And a lot of these faculty who we are interviewing, they work with traumatized populations. They work with marginalized students who are talking to them about the continuous discrimination and oppression that they're feeling in their programs. So what can we do about this? We need to start thinking about self-care. So one of the things that we can do is acknowledge to ourselves that we're experiencing trauma. Like, this is not normal. This is not the status quo. If we're starting to experience these things, we have to be able to admit to ourselves, and then we have to be able to talk to others. So one of the self-care strategies that I invoke with my team and the other research teams I've been a part of is to develop that team where you're able to have these conversations, to be able to have a space that we not only talk about what's happening in this particular research study, what's happening with our participants, but how are you as an individual experiencing these studies, these stories that are being shared, and what way are they impacting you in your daily lives? You need to have a healthy work-life balance. So you should not be thinking about your research topic 24 hours a day, which I know is really hard when you're trying to get done with your dissertation. You know, you think about it in the morning, you think about it at night. I had a student who said he wrote note cards and taped it in the shower. So, you know, constantly being a part of your experience. And if you're experiencing trauma due to your stories, the stories that you're hearing from your participants, that's not healthy. So you have to have a healthy work-life balance. You can exercise is really good to relieve stress. And particularly for Black women, research tells us that spirituality and meditation are really good health strategies to help you get through some of this vicarious trauma that you may be experiencing. And finally, sometimes it's okay to walk away. So not necessarily walk away forever, because we don't want to lose our novice qualitative researchers who become so overwhelmed with their research studies that they decide not to study or research our most vulnerable populations. But sometimes you have to step away to take a pause and say, maybe this is not the right time for me to do this particular study. Or maybe I just need to take a couple days off or a week off and have conversations with myself. Go see a therapist, go talk to individuals in your research team in order to be able to process what's going on. There's technology that you can use now. So my group, my research team has created a GroupMe. And so after every interview, they do a highlight in the GroupMe to say that this was a really difficult interview. If I forget to mention it on Wednesday, let's talk about it on Wednesday. Because if you're doing an interview on Thursday, by the time Wednesday comes back around, you have normalized it to yourself. Like, oh, it wasn't nothing. I was just being emotional. You know, I'm fine. When that may not necessarily be the case. Like, we need to have an opportunity to talk about how these things are impacting us. So I guess what's next on the agenda for me is to continue to research this phenomena, to figure out, you know, how are individuals who are working with vulnerable populations, and particularly in education, because that's just something that's not talked about, and how can we begin to support each other along this journey. This is not something for an individual, or this is not just something for qualitative researchers who work with vulnerable populations. This should be a community concern, right? We want the best that we can as far as young scholars to be able to come in and to do qualitative research. And we don't want them to leave because it becomes so overwhelming. If we allow that to happen, then we could be losing some of our best and brightest researchers. So it's not just for us, those of us who research vulnerable populations. It really is a task and a call for all researchers in the qualitative community. All right, and that is my talk. I hope that was helpful. I didn't pay attention to time, so I hope I didn't go too far over.
No, you're doing just fine, just fine. You gave us, once again, first we just want to say thank you for a great presentation, right? I think this is an issue that I think, like I saw a lot of the participants can understand, right? But oftentimes we haven't discussed this issue or learned how to actually cope with dealing with this type of trauma that comes from, right, working with people who are in part of marginalized communities. So just want to say thank you first and foremost for agreeing to be part of this, for a great presentation. So second, we're actually going to open things up for questions, right? So if any of the participants have questions, please feel free. But I'm going to start with a question, right? I'm going to use my platform to be able to do that. And you talked about compassion fatigue. That's a term I've never heard before. I wonder if you can actually elaborate a little bit more on what that is, what it looks like, and how someone who is, of course, doing qualitative research with a traumatized population, how can they actually cope with compassion fatigue?
Mm-hmm. So compassion fatigue is, I guess the definition is putting those two words together. So you really just become tired of having compassion. And so when we think about racial discrimination, when we think about microaggressions, and I don't like the word micro because they're all aggressions, right? There really are abuse, but we talk about microaggressions. They're not really microaggressions, right? And so when you experience those things over and over and over again, you become to the point where you just don't care anymore. So again, if you think about all the times we heard about police brutality, sometimes people hear it so much that they feel that it becomes the norm, and they don't necessarily have the compassion for it that they should. Like, oh, it's just another shooting, where no, we need to be paying attention to this and being concerned. And so if you are in the midst of doing a research project, and you know that people are sharing traumatized stories, and your reaction, which would normally be compassion, isn't compassion, it's possible that you could be experiencing compassion fatigue. So for example, in my particular research study, where we're looking at graduate student mental health, if someone is telling us about a traumatic story where they dropped out of graduate school, or they had health issues, mental health issues, or physical health issues due to something that happened in graduate school, and your response is, okay, great, I got another interview, move to the next one, that's problematic, because you're not engaging with the topic as you normally would. And so you're experiencing compassion fatigue. And so when you're working with vulnerable populations and marginalized populations who are consistently talking about these traumatic stories, it's really important to have someone to talk to about this. Because if we're having a conversation and you tell me something horrific and that's your response, it's up to me to say, wait a minute, something's going on here. You know, you're not responding in a way that you should based on the information that was provided. And so that way you can begin to kind of unravel that, and then to decide how do you want to handle that. Do you need to take a step back, maybe not do interviews for a while? Do you need to go to counseling to talk to someone about that? There's all different kind of ways that you can combat compassion fatigue.
Thank you for that. And does anyone else have any other questions? We can open the floor up now.
I have a question. So I have used a lot of the strategies you've talked about individually. You know, I realized, okay, maybe to be the best, you know, qualitative scholar and research instrument I need to address my own stuff so that I can be there for my participants. What would you recommend, though, to advisors and administrators? I'm looking at this too, moving into maybe one of those positions in a few years. How can I support, you know, my mentees who may be going through something similar? Because I have noticed a lack of support from my advisors.
Yes, I do a lot of research on mentoring, and so that is not uncommon, unfortunately. I would say for yourself, as you're moving into these administrative positions, that you model that behavior, and that you are allowed to set the culture in your particular lab or with your particular students. And so I can say I've been in both spaces. One where I would not necessarily talk about this at all, because if I talked about it, then I would be looked upon as I'm not a good researcher because I can't handle it, or I'm doing something wrong. And I've been in other spaces where this has been welcome. And so one thing that I do with my students is that I come into the space and I say, hey, you know what? I just had a really bad interview. I went home, I had a bad day. You know, I had to cry about it. Like, it really impacted me. I'm trying to figure out what to do with these emotions. And because I'm so vulnerable in that space, it allows them to be vulnerable too. So the best thing I think you can do is just model that behavior to create that space in your own environment.
Do you know why education doesn't, like you talked about, doesn't necessarily bring in this involve this, well, I don't know what word I want to use, just integrate the conversation about trauma?
Mm-hmm. I would say, I don't know exact reason, which is why I need to do more research. But if I had to speculate, I would say it's because they're not necessarily recognizing that the impact that our educational spaces are having on students. So the powers that be, they don't think that they are imparting trauma into these students' lives, because, I mean, you're getting into college, you're getting successful, you're in grad school, you're getting your degree, right? And so in order for that to happen, we need to take a step back and realize our role in some of those traumatic experiences. So in the health field or counseling field, like, these topics are common, like everyone is talking about this because it's part of your educational road. But in the education field, and particularly higher education, student affairs, things like that is not necessarily something that's common to talk about trauma. So if you're not familiar with the fact that trauma even exists, then you may not have those conversations. So if you're a researcher that studies financial aid, you may not never talk about trauma, right? It may not be something that comes up into your space. And so we need to bring this up to light, that individuals are having these conversations and are experiencing this.
So Carmen, to Leslie's question, one of the things I research is the ways in which tenure and promotion, the positivistic, academic capitalistic society that we're ingrained in and entrenched in provides epistemic injustice for grad students who might want to say, hey, this is important. I think it's important we talk about this. And so when you have faculty who are enculturated in terms of, it has to be a truth, capital T, you can't admit researchers have feelings, it has to be objective, right? Some of the things Carmen talked about in the beginning, constructivists believe in post-positivists believe in a lowercase t of truth. Constructivists, there are multiple realities that you're trying to uncover. What are these? Critical scholars will say, I don't even believe in that. I'm going to name this hegemonic oppressive society and research toward change, right? So you have, it's a false, continuum. They kind of blend together for some people. But to your point, Leslie, I think faculty are actually encouraged not to do this. If you do it, you're not going to get tenure. Your stuff isn't going to be published. You won't be recognized in the academy. And I think that's one of the things that I appreciate about Carmen is talking about this as a tenured person gives more salience to it, provides more for you all to cite, to argue with your committee, or maybe knowing power structures do exist. Educate. How do you educate your committee that this is important? Oh, here's this presentation that I went to with Dr. McCallum. Let me cite this presentation. And then as Carmen publishes, it provides more for you all to write on and then maybe publish yourself to help make change. Yeah. Carmen, what do you think about that as you've worked on this?
I think you're absolutely right about that structure and not being welcomed and not being a place where you can do it. And so, that happens a lot with mentoring too, is that, when we think about the tenure track, if the three things that you're being credited on are research, scholarship, research, service, and teaching, mentoring doesn't fall into those three. So I'm not going to put a lot of effort into my mentoring efforts because I'm not getting anything out of it. Right. And a lot of tenure track faculty do that, not necessarily because they want to, but because they're trying to survive. And so what I say is that we need to break down these structures. That is not a place that we try to survive, but that we're able to thrive. And so that's going to take a lot of work on a lot of different levels to allow that to happen.
So I have a question just based off, the comments that you made in terms of the tenure track process. And you said it's being focused on, of course, research, teaching, and service. So how would one go about having mentoring, being part of that tenure track process? Would that be a result of those professors who have tenure becoming part of that process and then changing what the requirements are? I mean, what would that look like?
For it to be part of the tenure process?
Yes.
I think you're exactly right. We need those who are in the power to be able to change the structure and what gets valued and what gets evaluated in that process. And so some of you may have been here right before, but we were talking about different structures of even hiring individuals. That's a big change in how things are normally done, right? So even if a dean or president is able to say, we're going to include mentoring as part of your tenure track process, people are going to do it because they know they're going to be able to move through the tenure process because of it. So it's up to all of you on the screen to get positions where you are in a position of power, or to be able to influence policy in order to make these changes.
Are there any other questions from our participants?
I have another question if no one else does. So I am doing a grounded theory study. I do a lot of memoing, and so I will, memo those experiences. Do you recommend incorporating that into my dissertation? The vulnerability and my experience with those interviews? And if so, how would you recommend incorporating that?
So I would love to say yes, absolutely, right? But I do know that we live in a power structure, and I do know that every choice that we make has consequences. And so I don't want you to step into a space of unwanted consequences. And so I think that's a conversation you should have with your dissertation chair to say, I'm really interested in putting this into my dissertation where I'm not only reflecting on my experiences with my participants, but I'm having this other reflection on how this research is affecting me, and I would like to do that. And if you have a dissertation chair that's open to that and supportive of that, yes. If not, then that may be something post-graduation.
Thanks.
My question is, you mentioned at the beginning that you are a qual researcher through and through, but you may do a little bit of mixed method. So I want to take you back to where most of us reside as interested in PhD programs or currently in a PhD program. I am in the counselor education side of things, and I am fairly certain that I want to be a qual researcher as well. What lended itself to you to decide, what, this is it, this is the route for me? We have some commonality, you and I, with the mental health and counseling piece, and I have thoughts on that, but I wonder if they are, similar to my thoughts on why I'm pursuing qual. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that from you.
Mm-hmm. I think a couple of different things. Although I tried to fight it, I was like, oh, I'm going to be quant. I would join a team that was all quant, and then they would switch to qual. I'm like, what is going on here? Like, how did this happen? But really, when you think about research, your questions should really guide you, right? And so I wasn't interested in understanding if, right? I wanted to know how and why. And the only way you can answer those questions is through a qualitative approach. Like, you have to talk to someone, observe someone, and get really deep into the essence of the phenomena to understand. And because of that, I knew that I would fall more on a qualitative side than a quantitative side. And again, social worker by heart. So, I've always been interested in people's stories. I always wanted to figure out what was going on. I always wanted to know why I decided to pursue a PhD versus those in my neighborhood who never went to college. Like, those are questions I wanted answered, and I couldn't answer that by just presenting a survey. So I knew that I wanted to be able to tell people's stories.
Yep, that's exactly it. So, counselor by trade. I know I have the young face, but my practice has been around for 10 years. So I'm doing counseling. I had 4 telehealth sessions this morning. So it's about the stories for me. It's about that level of engagement, understanding the human condition. So thank you so much for that.
And even when I'm doing reports, like a lot of times I do a lot of evaluation and assessment, and they would say they want the numbers, but it's the stories that always make them move, right? They don't know it until they hear it, but it's always the stories that make them move.
So Ezekiel, I'm going to put in the chat, Mark Grimmett is a faculty member who's at NC State. If you have not yet read his research, he focuses on Black men, on counseling. He actually runs a whole center for the community and for students. He's just, I will always sing his praises. He's amazing. So I just wanted to give a little shout out as another resource for you or anyone who's interested. He's got videos that are, for counseling and.
Well, yes, so we still have time for some more questions. Miriam, do you have a question?
Maybe I'll share a little bit from my field of Holocaust education. So the topic of compassion fatigue does come up, both in terms of researchers, people who collect oral histories. It's a huge literature, actually. And also in terms of second generation and third generation. And in that respect, it's interesting because it's a huge topic, again, both in terms of what they call intergenerational trauma, which has, people are studying physiological evidence of that, as well as spiritual and emotional. And I'll just add a little bit. Years ago, the concept of second generation, third generation sort of was embodied by a very negative vibe, meaning, oh, your parents, grandparents, Holocaust survivors, oh my goodness, you did not have a normal upbringing. All you heard was death, destruction, terrible atrocities. Now, some researchers, and if anyone's interested, I know some of them, there's a researcher at Yale, for example, they're looking at it from the aspect of resilience building. They're looking at it from the aspect of, you can hear a terrible story. What do you do with it then? And that is, again, a huge, huge topic, because that could depend on your age when you heard the story. That could depend on your position. I guess these normal psychological indicators, your position within the family, your personality indicators. So, but they're looking at it from they're trying to go beyond the very, very negative typecast that, if anyone looked at the literature in the 70s, was very, very heavy. Now they're trying to look for some of the, I don't want to say positive, but resilience building, sort of enabling you maybe to cope with trauma that you yourself will experience in a more open, you sort of expect it. That's kind of the bottom line, that the children of survivors expect trauma. They expect the floor to open up and you're going to fall down. That's been their history. So, in some cases, if you expect it, that means you're kind of prepared. So anyway, it's a huge, huge topic. I thought I would share it. I don't know if anybody wants, specific literature. I know a lot about it, but that's what I wanted to share.
No, thank you for sharing. That was really informative for me. And I also am excited that they're beginning to look at things from not a deficit perspective, right? They're trying to figure out what are the strengths of these experiences, which we all need to do, right? And so that's really exciting that the tables are starting to turn.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to see if Miriam could share her email address.
Oh, sure. I can put it in the chat.
Thank you.
If that's good. Sure.
Yes, we network here at the QualLab Lunch as well. So.
And it reminds me of some of the educational research about resilience and not going after the deficit model, as Carmen mentioned. And I think we have been doing that work for a bit, but not necessarily with this piece about researcher trauma. And also, I know with some of the people who research slavery and the second, third, fourth, generations that are happening, and the trauma that's intergenerational trauma that's going on for people. And so I see some parallels in the literature. William Smith with racial battle fatigue and the ways in which it's physical, heart conditions, your palms, your stress, the heart rates, everything that is physical manifestation of racial battle fatigue on a daily basis, as well as the intergenerational. Yeah. So important. Questions for Dr. McCallum? let me share then the little info, and then we could, if you want to stick around, and please chat with us for a little bit, because usually when we're in person, we can, go up to the presenter at the end. So we want to provide that opportunity for you all to do that too, but also let you go if you're set. So we also have the Unapologetic Educational Research Series. Here are the presenters. We had them last semester. The videos are up on the QualLab website. This is the slate of all EHE alums. So one's from counseling, one's from higher ed, the HESA program, and another's from ed leadership. So please come join or register. We have, those are larger, like 800 people around the country and a couple people in Canada and the UK. So you are welcome to come to those. I like both, the big and the intimate. So the rest of our QualLab lunches are set and ready to go. And so here are the ones that we have going on if you're interested in IRB and working on some of the things Carmen was talking about today in terms of how you build it into your IRB proposal about not just actually giving some resources, but going beyond that in an intentional way. So those would be some things that you could talk about there. Rhodesia McMillan is one of the postdocs, the Dean's Equity postdocs, and she's going to share about in vivo. She does ed policy work and is very knowledgeable about in vivo. And then Kim and I will talk about grants, how to get them. It's a lot of faculty or postdocs end up going to that one. We have a grad student board, and so Bakari is the main contact for the grad student board, students who are doing different sessions and things for you all. It's a group of about 15, give or take, depending on, so it's been a nice community. And here's the QualLab information, of course, but you know how to get there since you all registered for this. Let's say thank you to Dr. McCallum. Thank you so much, Carmen. Your work was just so wonderful, so appreciative of it, and about pushing the field more in this area. So I just think that's a huge contribution, and it's so needed. As you all pointed out through your questions were so on point. Your contributions, I think, are what made this, even better with Carmen. So thank you all for participating. It's better because you were here. Thank you. So we'll actually conclude, and thanks for Bakari for organizing this and bringing us all together. And you can take off, or if you'd like to, chit chat, and as we would if we were in person, and kind of stand in line to talk to Dr. McCallum, please feel free to stick around. So hopefully we'll see you next time.
Yes, yeah, thank